67 years old, a hearing aid in my left ear, and a hip replacement that predicts rain better than Met service. And somehow none of that was the hardest part of the day my son invited me to go fishing. The hardest part was what my wife said when we were both bleeding in the dark at the bottom of a ravine. But we'll get there. Welcome to Silver Verdict. Grab something warm, find a comfortable chair, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They made their choice. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me. You're going to want to hear all of this. My name is Graham Whitfield, 67. Retired structural surveyor from Tauranga, Bay of Plenty. 41 years reading the bones of buildings, writing reports that told developers whether their dreams would stand or collapse. There is a particular kind of clarity you develop doing that work. You learn to see failure before it happens. You learn to read stress fractures in things that look perfectly solid from the outside. I thought I was good at it. I thought I could read anything. I was wrong about the one structure that mattered most. My wife is Patricia Whitfield, 63. Former secondary school librarian. Tauranga Girls College, 28 years. Gardener, maker of the best pavlova in the Bay of Plenty. And I will argue that point with anyone. 36 years of marriage. I thought I knew the full inventory of her. I did not know the first thing. Our son is Callum Whitfield, 34. Works in property development. Got my stubbornness and his mother's ability to appear calm while doing something completely calculated. Dangerous combination. I know that now. 3 years ago, he brought home a woman named Sophie Renner. Pleasant, bright. Degree in landscape architecture from Massey. She made Callum laugh in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager kicking a ball around the back paddock. Patricia adored her. I liked her enormously. We were glad for our son. Or we thought we were glad for our son. We were glad for the person we thought he'd brought home. Saturday, June 14th. I remember the date precisely because it was the day after our 36th anniversary, which Patricia and I had celebrated quietly with a bottle of Marlborough Pinot Noir and a fish and chips from the wharf. The next morning, Callum rang and said he wanted to take me fishing at the Wairoa River gorge track. Just the two of us, he said. Dad and son time. He said Sophie would drop us off and pick Patricia up, take her for a drive to the Kaimais while we fished. Patricia had been talking about seeing the kauri on the ridge. It seemed thoughtful. It was supposed to seem thoughtful. I brought my rod, my tackle box, a thermos of tea, and not a single useful instinct. The track down to the gorge is steep but manageable. I've walked it perhaps 20 times over the years. Callum was easy company on the way down, the way he always was when he wanted something and hadn't asked for it yet. He asked about my old workmates. He asked about the garden. He laughed at my jokes in the way adult children do when they're trying to be generous to their fathers. I know what that was now. I know exactly what it was. Here is what you need to understand about our family property before any of this makes sense. Patricia and I own a residential section and a separate block of rural land outside Te Puke, the house section we live on, and a 13-hectare block about 6 kilometers away that her parents left her when they passed. Her father, Ross Henare, bought it in 1987 for next to nothing steep, scrubby, beautiful land running along a creek. Manuka, mostly. Some old pasture going feral. A broken-down implement shed. Patricia grew up going there on school holidays. It meant something to her that was hard to put into words. It turns out it also meant something to other people. Quite a lot of something, as it turned out. We just didn't know that yet. 2 months before this fishing trip, an envelope arrived from a company called Ridgecrest Land Holdings, registered in Auckland. Something about rural development opportunities and an expression of interest in our Te Puke block. I put it on the kitchen bench. I assumed it was another one of those form letters developers send to half the district. Patricia picked it up, read it. Set it back down without a word. I didn't notice that she set it back down very carefully. I should have noticed. The track narrows at a section about 40 minutes in, where the gorge drops away on the left side and a slip face runs up steeply on the right. I've walked that section dozens of times. The river sounds get louder there. You pay attention to your feet. I was watching my footing on a wet rock when it happened. I heard a sound, a quick intake of breath behind me. Then the path was gone and I was falling sideways into the scrub on the gorge edge, shoulder first, and something was wrong because I hadn't lost my balance. Something had hit me. Both hands. Hard. Deliberate. And then, there was no more path. Just the sound of the river getting closer. The drop was about 12 meters onto a gravel shelf above the waterline. I went through a Kanuka branch on the way down. It probably saved my life and did considerable damage in the process. I hit the shelf on my left side, hip screaming. Ribs. The world went very quiet, except for the river and the ringing in my ear, where the hearing aid had been. Patricia. She was 6 meters from me on the same shelf, sitting upright against a boulder, both hands pressing into her knee. Blood on her forearm from the scrub. Face pale, but completely steady. I dragged myself toward her on my hands. The hip was not right. I knew it wasn't right. Graham. Her voice was level in a way that frightened me more than screaming would have. Are you badly hurt? I don't know yet. You? My knee. And my wrist. She looked up toward the track. How far above are they? I could hear voices. Callum's voice. Oh God. Oh no. And then Sophie's voice, cutting clean through his. Can you see them? Silence. Then Callum again. Quieter. I can't tell. And then Sophie, very quiet, very certain. We have to go for help. We have to go now. Not I'll call 111. Not I'm going to try and reach them. We have to go now. I opened my mouth. Patricia's hand found my arm. The grip was extraordinary for a woman with a damaged wrist. Don't. One word. Don't make a sound. Patricia. She looked at me. Her eyes were completely clear. She wasn't in shock. She had been waiting for this moment, or something like it, and she had already decided what to do. Stay quiet. Let them think. We're down. The voices moved away above us. Footsteps on the track, receding, gone. The river filled the silence where my son's voice had been. I lay on that gravel shelf for what I think was about 3 minutes, and felt the weight of 36 years of marriage settle around me in an entirely new shape. Then Patricia made a sound I'd never heard her make in all those years. Like something releasing. Nined. Like a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time, and had finally, for whatever terrible reason, been permitted to exhale. There's something I need to tell you, she said. About the land. About Sophie. About what I've known and what I should have told you a long time ago. And on a gravel shelf at the bottom of a river gorge, with a broken hip and 3 cracked ribs, I lay still and listened to my wife tell me a story she had been keeping for 19 years. The woman Callum brought home, she said. Sophie Renner. I need to tell you about the real Sophie Renner. She paused. She pressed harder on her knee. The real Sophie Renner lives in Wellington. She's a landscape architect, just as they said. She has a partner and a 2-year-old daughter. She has no idea her name is being used. I found her on LinkedIn 8 months ago. I looked her up because something about the story felt slightly wrong. The real Sophie Renner went to Massey, yes. But she graduated 2 years before the woman in our house says she did. She never lived in Tauranga. She doesn't know our son. I couldn't find any words. The river was very loud. The woman in our house is not Sophie Renner, Patricia continued. I don't know her real name. I don't know who she's working for, but I know what she's been looking for. She paused. Because I'm the one who hid it. Hid what, Patricia? What did you hide? My wife looked at me with the expression of a person finally setting down a weight they have carried so long it had become simply part of their posture. Before Dad died, she said, he told me something he'd never told anyone. When he bought the Tepuk block in 1987, he bought it from a man named Leonard Strachan, old family from the district, in debt. Needed out quickly. Dad paid $6,200 for 13 hectares, all properly recorded at the Land Information Office. Legal, on its face. She stopped. Her jaw worked. But Dad had known before he bought it that 11 of those hectares, the eastern side, the creek block, were the subject of an unresolved Maori land claim, a partition that had never been properly settled in the 1970s. Leonard Strachan didn't disclose it. Dad didn't disclose it when he registered the title. He told me when he was dying. He said he'd always meant to sort it out. He said he hadn't known how. I lay on that gravel shelf and felt the shape of my marriage reorganize itself around this information. And you've known since he died. She looked at the water. 19 years. I told myself I'd look into it properly. Then Derek, she stopped, corrected herself, then Callum was born, and life moved. And I told myself the claim was probably long expired, but I kept the letter Dad left me. His written account of what Leonard had told him and what he'd done. I kept it in a waterproof document case in the old implement shed, under the floorboards. Why there? Because I was 28 and frightened, and it seemed like a place where things could stay safely unresolved. She looked at me. I know. How long have you known about the woman in our house? A long silence. The river. A fantail moving through the Kanuka above us. 8 months. 8 months. You sat at our dinner table for 8 months. I was finding out what I needed to find out. Her voice was quiet, but it had that particular precision she used when she had thought something through completely. If I'd reacted, they would have moved. I needed to understand how far Callum was into it. I needed to understand who sent her and why. I looked at my wife, bleeding and damaged on a river gravel shelf, and understood for the first time that I had spent 36 years being married to someone considerably more formidable than I had known. How far is Callum into it? She didn't answer. Which was an answer. Getting Patricia up 12 meters of wet gorge wall with a damaged knee, my broken hip, a torn jacket turned into a makeshift brace, and a walking pole I had somehow not lost in the fall, took 56 minutes, and language that I will not reproduce here. At the 20-minute mark, Patricia told me I was compensating wrong for the hip, and I told her that with the greatest respect, she was not a structural surveyor, and she told me that with the greatest respect, a hip was not a building, and I told her this was genuinely the wrong moment for that argument. And she said every moment was the wrong moment for an argument you were going to lose. I loved her so profoundly in that moment that the broken hip seemed almost beside the point. At the top, the track was empty. Callum's car was gone. My ute was parked at the trailhead where I'd left it. Tucked under the wiper blade was a manila envelope. Inside was a document I'd never seen before. A land transfer form for the Te Puke block, registered to a company called Ridgecrest Land Holdings Limited, with what were presented as Patricia's signature and mine. We hadn't signed anything. Patricia read it twice, looked up. The signatures were very good, confident, unhurried. My stomach moved slowly. I looked at my watch. 12:40 p.m. The land information. New Zealand office would stop processing same-day registrations at close of business. I did not know exactly what window we had, but I knew it was small. I got Patricia into the passenger seat, hip grinding, and pulled out my phone. Ring Margaret Tao, Patricia said. Margaret Tao was our family solicitor. 61, sharp, entirely unimpressed by urgency unless the urgency was genuine. 2 rings. Patricia. I'm at my daughter's football match. Margaret. We need an emergency caveat on the Te Puke rural block. There's a forged transfer to Ridgecrest Land Holdings Limited. We also need to flag this to LINZ immediately. Patricia's voice was steady as anything. A pause. How forged? Very professionally. Another pause. And why do you sound like you're calling from the bottom of a river? We were. Until recently. Patricia. Are you physically safe? We're going to Tauranga Hospital. Can you make the call first? Silence. Then. I'm calling Warren Fisk. He's LINZ's legal counsel, and he owes me a considerable favor. Give me 15 minutes. Margaret reached Warren Fisk at 1:08 p.m. The caveat was lodged electronically at 1:23 p.m. Ridgecrest's attempted registration, which came through at 1:47 p.m., was automatically flagged and held. 24 minutes. That was the margin. I found out that number sitting in the Tauranga Hospital car park watching orderlies bring a wheelchair for Patricia. Feeling the adrenaline leave my body like tide going out. Everything that had been quiet during the emergency was now very loud. Hip. Ribs. Both palms. The particular grief of knowing what had happened on that track. Patricia's phone buzzed. Callum. Dad. I've been trying to reach you both. We waited at the top for ages. Sophie is really worried. Can you please ring me? I looked at the message for a long time. I thought about him at 9 years old asleep in the car, on the way home from rugby, boots still on, face dirty. I thought about him at 20, ringing me from his first flat, embarrassed but needing advice. I thought about the way he'd looked when he first brought Sophie home. That particular hopefulness adult children can't quite hide from their parents. Then I thought about 2 hands. Flat. Deliberate. I put the phone in my pocket. Inside, the doctor was telling Patricia she had a grade 3 knee sprain, a fractured radial head in her wrist, and mild concussion from the fall. She was disputing the concussion assessment with the focused composure of a woman who had considerably more urgent things to address. I sat beside her bed and started my list. Ridgecrest Land Holdings Limited. Auckland registration. Director and contact details. The real Sophie Renner in Wellington confirm identity. Establish how the name was being used. The document case under the implement shed floor. We needed it before anyone else did. The land claim Patricia's father had buried 19 years old but potentially still live. And Callum. My son. Somewhere on a dial between calculating and deceived, and I was going to find out exactly where. I worked through the night on Patricia's laptop while she slept. Wairoa Valley Hospital was quiet. A nurse brought me terrible coffee at 2 a.m. and asked if I needed anything. I said I needed a property law database, and she gave me a biscuit instead, which was honestly the more useful offering. By 5:30 a.m., I had 6 pages of notes. Ridgecrest Land Holdings Limited was registered in Auckland 14 months ago. Its sole director was listed as a man named Trevor Aldworth, a licensed property agent based in Hamilton with a background in rural land acquisition throughout the Waikato and Bay of Plenty. I cross-referenced his name against historical property transactions in the Te Puke district going back 20 years. In 2018, he had acted as agent for a company that had purchased 3 separate rural blocks along the same creek system as our land. In 2021, another acquisition. Adjacent. Our 13 hectares completed a corridor. I pulled geological survey records filed 18 months ago. Bore testing along the creek system. Mitigation engineering assessments. The kind of documentation you commission before you approach the market. Not after. Our land sat over what the survey described as an extractable blue metal aggregate deposit of significant commercial scale. Blue metal. Roading material. Construction aggregate for the development boom rolling through the Bay of Plenty. The estimate in the survey was between $12 and $30 million of extractable material, $12 to $30 million under an old implement shed and Patricia's buried document case. I sat in that hospital chair looking at those numbers and felt the whole architecture of the past 3 years snap into a shape I could finally read. The letter from Ridgecrest. Sophie who wasn't Sophie. Callum's increasingly specific questions over the past year about the Tepuke land. Whether we'd thought about selling. Whether we'd had it properly valued recently. All of it load-bearing. All of it pointing at this. I looked at my wife asleep across the room and felt something solidify in my chest. "All right," I said quietly, to no one in particular. "Let's see what holds." Patricia was discharged the following morning. She read my 6 pages sitting in the passenger seat before we'd left the car park. When she finished, she looked out the window at Tauranga Harbor in the early morning light for a long time without speaking. "He's been working toward this for at least 2 years, she said. "I think longer." She turned to look at me. "How do you want to handle our son?" "Carefully," I said. And then, not carefully at all. Callum's car was in our driveway when we got home. He'd let himself in with his key. He and the woman who called herself Sophie were in the kitchen. He stood up when we walked in. The color left his face so completely and so fast that under other circumstances I might have been concerned for him. "Dad." He looked at Patricia. "Mum. We were so worried. We looked for you for—" "Sit down, Callum." He sat. He looked very young. He looked like the boy who'd broken the kitchen window with a cricket ball at 13 and hadn't known how to tell me for 3 days. Except the cricket ball had been 2 people falling into a river gorge, so the comparison had limits. "Where is she?" I asked. His eyes moved to the hallway. "Callum." Patricia's voice was very quiet, very even. "Did you know she wasn't Sophie before or after you brought her to the house for dinner the first time?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Before." Patricia nodded. Like she was filing a document she'd already written. It came out of him in pieces then, the way these things do when the container finally fails. A man named Trevor Aldworth had approached him 22 months ago, presented himself as an investor with a legitimate title query on the Tepuke land, showed him the survey results, told him the aggregate deposit made the land significantly valuable, and explained that a prior ownership complication meant a legal challenge to the title was coming regardless. Cooperation, Aldworth said, meant the family received a negotiated settlement before the process became adversarial. A figure, $1.4 million. That was the number my son had been offered to bring an operative into our home and find Patricia's buried documents. He said nobody would be hurt, Callum said. He said it would look voluntary. He said you'd receive fair value. Patricia looked at him for a long time, with an expression I couldn't quite read. I think it was the expression of a mother recalibrating. "You brought a stranger into our home," she said. "You sat at our table every Sunday. You looked us in the eye." Callum put his face in both hands. I watched him and tried to hold the 2 things at once. The boy I'd raised, and the man who'd stood on a track above a gorge and made a choice. People want these things to be simple. They're not simple. He wasn't a monster, and he wasn't innocent. He was a 34-year-old man who had wanted money more than he'd wanted to be the person we'd tried to raise him to be. That's its own kind of tragedy. It doesn't cancel the harm, but it's the truth. And I've spent 41 years in a profession that runs on truth, whether or not the truth is convenient. "Stay in this room," I said. "Don't touch your phone." I walked down the hallway without knocking. She was awake, dressed, standing near the window with her bag already in her hand. She'd heard the front door and made her assessment, and she was ready. She arranged her face into startled relief the moment I entered. "Graham." "Oh, thank God." "Put the bag down." The relief dropped off her face like a coat coming off. What replaced it was nothing. A professional blankness. The mask removed. It told me everything I needed to know about what she actually was. "Here's what's happening." I said, leaning on the doorframe. Detective Sergeant Karen Olson from the Tauranga CIB has had a formal assault report and a fraud complaint since 7 o'clock this morning. Margaret Tao lodged a caveat on the Tapuke land at 1:23 p.m. yesterday. Ridgecrest's registration attempt was flagged and held. I watched her jaw tighten. Trevor Aldworth's office in Hamilton was served with an injunction this morning. The Law Society received a complaint against any solicitors involved at 8:30. I tilted my head slightly. The real Sophie Renner is in Wellington, entirely unaware her identity's been used. We spoke to her at 10 last night. She's made her own statement. She was very still. I also pulled the Gorge Track's trailhead camera footage. The Bay of Plenty Regional Council installed a new wildlife monitoring camera at that car park 18 months ago. It covers the track entrance. She looked at me. I want to speak to a lawyer. Best thing you've said since you walked in our front door. I stepped back. Kitchen. Sit with my son while you both wait for D.S. Olson. Trevor Aldworth was arrested 4 days later. Fraud, forgery, filing false instruments, conspiracy to obtain property by deception. When D.S. Olson's team examined his land acquisition history across the Bay of Plenty and Waikato over 12 years, the charges expanded considerably. He had used variations of this approach, an operative placed near a target family, document location and removal, forged transfer on 2 previous occasions. The Tapuke block was the most valuable target he had ever attempted. The woman who had called herself Sophie was a former legal conveyancing clerk from Christchurch named Dana Purcell. Fraud history. Prior conviction in 2020. She took a plea arrangement, cooperated fully with the investigation against Aldworth, and received a suspended sentence and community service. I will not pretend I was satisfied with that outcome. I wasn't. But the case against Aldworth was built in part on her testimony, and the result for him was not suspended. Margaret Tao spent 4 months working with a specialist Maori land law barrister on Patricia's father's 19-year-old disclosure. The unresolved partition claim was genuine and live, and held by an iwi authority that had quietly been pursuing it through the Maori land court for 11 years. Margaret's position, and ultimately the court's finding, was that the the Whitfield family, had come forward voluntarily with the disclosure documentation, had not benefited from concealment, and had acted in good faith once the information was known. The settlement negotiation between the iwi authority and our family took 7 months. I will not detail the specific terms. What I will say is that the outcome was fair, that Patricia cried when Margaret rang to confirm it, and that the document her father had left, his handwritten account, his acknowledgement of what he'd done wrong, was read into the record at the land court hearing. He'd been dead for 19 years. The record hurt him anyway. Aldworth went to trial. I gave evidence for 2.5 hours. I wore my good jacket, the one I'd bought for Patricia's retirement function 7 years ago. I wanted to look exactly like what I was. A 67-year-old retired surveyor from Tauranga, who had taken his son fishing and ended up at the bottom of a river gorge, and who had subsequently spent a considerable amount of energy ensuring that the person responsible understood how poor a decision that had been. The jury took 8 hours, guilty on all counts. I watched Aldworth's face when the verdict came. He looked like a man who had assessed a structure as sound and couldn't understand why it had collapsed. As someone who spent 41 years in structural assessment, I could have explained it to him. You built on a foundation you didn't fully examine. You didn't account for what was already in the ground, and you moved against people who had more load-bearing capacity than you knew. That's not bad luck. That's bad engineering. Callum cooperated fully, gave evidence against Aldworth, sat at our kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in September, and said the things that needed saying, while Patricia and I said the things that needed saying back. None of it was brief. None of it was easy. Most of it stays between us. It belongs to our family and our family alone. No prison for Callum. Cooperating witness status, deferred prosecution, 18 months of conditions including community service and mandatory counseling. He needed the counseling before any of this happened. That's the honest truth. He moved out of the rental he'd shared with Dana Purcell and into a smaller flat in Mount Maunganui. He rings on Sunday evenings. Patricia always answers first ring. I get there by the second or third, depending on where I'm sitting. He came to the land court hearing, sat 3 rows back and didn't speak, walked out after the finding was read. Patricia caught up with him in the car park, and they stood together by his car for about 20 minutes. I watched from the steps. I don't know everything that was said. I know she hugged him before she came back. Patricia is, and always has been, a better person than I am. We dismantled the implement shed in October. Under the concrete floor, wrapped in an oilskin inside a sealed metal document case that had held through 19 Bay of Plenty winters, were 2 pieces of paper. Her father's handwritten account and a letter from the Iwi Kaumatua, who had first raised the original claim in 1978, kept by Ross Henare, dated 1989. Patricia held the letter for a long time before she passed it to Margaret. "What does it say?" I asked. She was quiet a moment. "He says he hopes whoever finds this understands that the land remembers. He says he has faith that right process will find its way. He says he has written to 3 different authorities, and none have answered. He says he is tired but not finished." She folded it with great care. "He says the truth does not expire." I looked at my wife. 4 months from the gorge, walking without the knee brace now. Tomato seedlings already on the windowsill for spring. A new novel on the bedside table on top of 2 others. Same as always, like nothing in the world had interrupted her. I thought about what it means to carry something alone for 19 years out of fear and uncertainty, and to finally put it down in the right hands. I thought about load-bearing capacity, how you don't always know how much a structure can hold until it is tested past the point where you thought it would fail. "He had good faith to spare," I said. Patricia handed the letter to Margaret. "He did. We still go to the Te Puke block. Not to fish, there's a better spot north of Paengaroa anyway. We walk the creek boundary, which Patricia knows by heart, and look at the manuka coming back thick on the old pasture slope, and listen to the water. We don't talk much about what happened at the gorge. We don't need to. It is simply part of the geography of our marriage now. Like the year Derek, like the year Callum was in hospital with his appendix at 16, like the week I was made redundant in 1998 and didn't tell Patricia for 3 days because I was ashamed. These things happen. They become the ground you stand on. They are not the end of the story. They are evidence that the story is still going. Someone once told me that the most dangerous failures in structural work are the ones that look fine on the surface. The crack you can't see from the outside. The settlement happening slowly beneath the foundation. The repair that was done cosmetically rather than structurally. I spent my career teaching people to look properly, to not accept the surface reading, to go back to the original documentation, check the actual ground conditions, find where the load was really going. Our family had a crack we hadn't looked at directly, a buried document, a buried guilt, a son who had drifted somewhere we hadn't noticed until the drift had carried him to the edge of something unforgivable. None of it was invisible in hindsight. The signs were there. The lesson, if there is one, and I think there is that the structures we don't inspect are not protected by our avoidance. They are only failing more quietly. If someone in your family is carrying something they haven't told you, if there is a document, a decision, a silence that has been there so long it feels like furniture, it is worth the discomfort of looking at it directly. Held truths do not disappear. They find their own way to the surface. Better that you choose the moment then the moment chooses you. The gorge track reopened after the regional council completed their safety assessment 3 months later. New section of barrier on the narrow stretch above where we fell. Patricia and I walked it in November. Same track, same thermos, same gray morning light coming through the Kanuka. We stood at the narrow section and looked down at the shelf where we'd spent those hours on the gravel. And I put my arm around her, and we didn't say anything for a while. Then Patricia said, "Your hip is going to complain tomorrow. I know. You should have brought a second pole." Patricia. She leaned into me, looking at the water. "I'm glad we didn't fall further." "I know. So am I." The river was still there. The gorge was still there. So were we. That's the only verdict that matters in the end. Not the guilty count. Not the settlement figure. Not the court record. It's the November morning. The cold on your face. The tea still warm at the hard part of the track. It's standing in the place where something tried to break you. With the person who held your arm in the dark, and knowing with complete certainty that it didn't. Whatever has been done to you, whatever breach of trust, whatever exploitation of your goodness and your love, do not let it take your willingness to keep walking the track. That willingness is not naivety. It is the thing that outlasts everyone who bet against you. Thank you for being here. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Silver Verdict and leave a comment below. Your presence here makes these stories worth telling.